Welcome to the Core Stream. The BYE podcast presents Matrix. Complexity reduced to logic, structured elements.
BYE Matrix, Episode 7, The Data Compression Paradox and Spatial Architecture. Welcome back to the BYE Matrix. If you have initiated this 7th transmission, you possess the cognitive bandwidth required for an uncompromising deconstruction of reality. Today, we discard the illusory comfort of infinite digital space to interface directly with the invisible scaffolding of efficiency, the mechanics of compression. We are not here to indulge in simplified filing analogies, we are here to interrogate the underlying mathematical compromises between processing time and spatial conservation, the psychological exploitation of human sensory limits, and the structural vulnerabilities inherent in squeezing information into tight physical sectors. Prepare your neural pathways for a severe paradigm shift. The threshold has been crossed. BYE Matrix is now active.
Compaction is never an act of creation, it is an act of redistribution. Nothing that constitutes a file disappears when it is compressed. What happens instead is that redundancy, the statistical repetition inherent in almost all structured data, is identified, extracted, and re-expressed in a shorter symbolic form. The bytes you save on disk are not deleted information, they are information that has been re-encoded into a denser alphabet, and that re-encoding is not without cost. The cost is deferred, not eliminated, and it is deferred onto the processor, onto the memory bus, and onto the fragility of the resulting structure. To understand compaction properly, you must stop thinking of it as shrinkage and start thinking of it as a currency exchange, where space is converted into computation at an exchange rate that is rarely favorable and never free. Begin with the algorithmic core, because this is where the exchange rate is set. An uncompressed file of n bytes occupies, trivially, order n space, and reading or writing it costs order n time, since every byte is touched exactly once. The moment you introduce an entropy coder, this linearity fractures. Take Huffman coding, the archetypal example. Huffman construction begins by tabulating the frequency of every distinct symbol in the input, an operation that is itself order n, since every byte must be inspected. But the construction of the binary tree from those frequencies is not linear. It proceeds by repeatedly extracting the two lowest frequency nodes from a priority queue and merging them into a parent node, and each extraction from a properly maintained minute heap costs order log k, where k is the number of distinct symbols remaining in the queue. Since this extraction must happen k-1 times to collapse the queue into a single root, the tree construction phase alone costs order k log k. For byte-oriented alphabets, k is bounded by 256, so in practice this looks deceptively cheap, but the moment you extend Huffman coding to larger alphabets, such as words in a text corpus rather than individual bytes, k grows with the vocabulary size, and the log k term becomes materially significant. Encoding the actual data, once the tree exists, is again order n, since each symbol is replaced by its corresponding prefix code via a table lookup. So Huffman's total cost sits at order n plus k log k, and for large k, that second term is the one that erodes any assumption of pure linearity. Lempel-Ziv is a different animal entirely, and its cost structure is worse in the naive case. LZ77 operates over a sliding window, a bounded lookback buffer, searching for the longest substring in that window which matches the upcoming input. A brute force implementation of this search, comparing the upcoming bytes against every possible starting position in the window, costs order w per character, where w is the window size, giving a total complexity of order n times w. For a window of only a few kilobytes this is survivable. For the multi-megabyte windows used by modern compressors such as ZSTD or LZMA, brute force matching becomes catastrophic, potentially degenerating towards quadratic behavior, order n squared, on adversarial or highly repetitive input. This is precisely why production-grade implementations abandon brute force search and instead build auxiliary indexing structures over the window, hash chains, where every sequence of 3 or 4 bytes is hashed into a bucket pointing to prior occurrences, allowing candidate matches to be located in near-constant time rather than scanned linearly, or suffix automata and suffix arrays, which precompute the full set of substring relationships within the window at a construction cost of order w. Log w, but which then permit match finding in order log w per query. The practical consequence is that real-world LZ implementations sit closer to order n log W, not because the underlying problem became easier, but because engineers paid a one-off indexing cost to convert a linear search into a logarithmic one. This is the first concrete instance of the trade-off. You are not avoiding cost, you are choosing where in the pipeline to place it, either amortized across construction of an index or paid repeatedly across naive search. Now overlay the physical architecture of the machine executing these algorithms, because the asymptotic complexity only tells half the story. The constant factors, which asymptotic notation deliberately discards, are where the real damage occurs. A modern CPU does not fetch operands directly from main memory for each instruction. It fetches from a hierarchy of caches, L1, L2, and L3, each successively larger and successively slower. L1 cache, typically 32 to 64 kilobytes per core and split between instruction and data, offers latency in the range of 3 to 5 clock cycles. L2, larger, perhaps 256 kilobytes to 1 megabyte, costs roughly 10 to 20 cycles. L3, shared across cores and running into tens of megabytes, costs somewhere between 30 and 70 cycles. Main memory, DRAM, sitting beyond all of this, costs somewhere in the region of 100 to 300 cycles, depending on whether the memory controller must also handle a TLB miss, a translation look-aside buffer miss, which forces a page table walk before the physical address can even be resolved. Compression algorithms are, structurally, cache hostile. Consider LZ77's dictionary search. The sliding window, by design, must span a substantial portion of recently processed data, frequently exceeding the capacity of L1 and often exceeding L2 as well. Every dictionary lookup that misses the smaller, faster caches forces a fetch from a slower cache tier or from DRAM directly, and this is not a rare event, it is the dominant operation in the inner loop of the compressor. The access pattern is also frequently non-sequential, since hashchain lookups jump to arbitrary prior offsets within the window rather than progressing linearly, which defeats hardware prefetchers that are optimized for sequential or strided access patterns. The prefetcher, unable to predict the next address, cannot stage it into cache ahead of time, so the CPU stalls, waiting on the memory subsystem, unable to retire the instruction until the operand arrives. Multiply a penalty of 100 to 300 cycles by the millions of symbol lookups required to compress even a modestly sized file, and the aggregate stall time becomes the dominant cost of the entire operation, dwarfing the arithmetic cost of the comparisons and copies themselves. This is why compression throughput, measured in megabytes per second, plateaus well below what raw CPU clock speed would suggest is achievable. The bottleneck is not computation, it is memory latency, and no amount of algorithmic elegance escapes the physical fact that data must travel from where it is stored to where it is processed, and that journey has a fixed, non-negotiable cost in cycles. Decompression reimposes an inverted but structurally similar cost. The decoder walking a Huffman tank does so bit by bit, a fundamentally serial operation. Each bit determines a branch, left or right, and the decoder cannot know which branch to take next until the current one is resolved. This serial dependency chain prevents instruction-level parallelism and defeats speculative execution, since the branch predictor has no meaningful pattern to learn from what is, by design, close to statistically random bit sequences, that being the entire point of entropy coding, to drive the output towards maximal unpredictability. Every mispredicted branch costs a pipeline flush, typically in the range of 15 to 20 cycles on modern out-of-order cores. LZ decompression, by contrast, is less branch-heavy but is instead dominated by the cost of copying back-reference sequences, an operation that itself depends on data written earlier in the same decompression pass, creating a data dependency that similarly constrains how much of the work can be pipelined or vectorized. The compression and decompression loop is therefore not a single cost paid once, it is a recurring tax paid at both write time and every subsequent read time, for as long as the data remains compressed, meaning that frequently accessed compressed data pays this cache and branch penalty repeatedly across its lifetime, not merely at the moment of initial storage.
Turn now to the question of structural fragility, because this is where compaction's cost stops being merely temporal and becomes existential to the integrity of the data itself. Natural, uncompressed data, particularly structured formats such as plain text, carries enormous redundancy, repeated words, predictable byte sequences, statistical regularities in character frequency. This redundancy is, from a pure information theoretic standpoint, waste, and it is precisely this waste that entropy coding identifies and eliminates. But redundancy, from an error-resilient standpoint, is not waste at all, it is insurance. Error correction codes function by deliberately reintroducing structured redundancy, calculated parity information appended to or interleaved with the payload, so that when physical corruption occurs, a flipped bit on a disk platter, a misread cell in flash memory, electromagnetic interference on a transmission line, the decoder can use that parity to detect the discrepancy and, within the mathematical limits of the code's Hamming distance, reconstruct the original value. A Hamming code, in its simplest form, arranges data bits alongside parity bits positioned at power of 2 indices, each parity bit covering a specific subset of data bits determined by binary indexing, such that the pattern of which parity checks fail uniquely identifies the position of a single bit error, allowing it to be flipped back with certainty. Reed-Solomon codes generalize this into the domain of polynomial arithmetic over finite fields, treating the data as coefficients of a polynomial and encoding additional redundant points on that polynomial's curve, such that even if several symbols are lost or corrupted entirely, the original polynomial, and therefore the original data, can be reconstructed through polynomial interpolation, provided the number of erasures does not exceed the code's designed correction capacity. The critical failure mode arises because entropy-coded, compressed data actively works against the assumptions these correction schemes depend upon. ECC schemes are engineered to exploit redundancy. They assume that surrounding bits carry information correlated with the corrupted bit, information sufficient to triangulate the correct original value. Maximally compressed data, by design, has had that correlation surgically removed. Each output bit approaches the theoretical entropy limit, meaning it carries close to one full bit of genuinely independent information, with no redundant structure left for an error-correcting scheme to exploit even if one were applied downstream. Now trace the mechanical consequence of a single bit flip inside such a stream. In a Huffman-coded file, the decoder's position within the prefix tree is determined entirely by the sequence of bits read so far. There are no synchronization markers delimiting where one symbol's code ends and the next begins, because eliminating exactly that kind of overhead is the entire economic justification for prefix coding in the first place. A single flipped bit alters the decoder's trajectory through the tree at that point, and every subsequent bit is now interpreted relative to the wrong tree position, producing not one incorrect symbol but an unpredictable cascade of incorrect symbols stretching to the end of the stream, since the decoder has no mechanism to detect that it has derailed, let alone to resynchronize. In an LZ-coded stream, the problem compounds through a second mechanism, back references. Later portions of the decoded output are reconstructed not from freshly encoded literals but from pointers referring back to earlier decoded output. Copy this many bytes from this many positions back. If an early symbol is corrupted, any subsequent match that copies from the region containing that corrupted symbol propagates the corruption forward, and if further matches later reference that now doubly corrupted region, the error compounds multiplicatively rather than remaining localized. This is the structural reason compressed archive formats such as XZIP or ZIP wrap the compressed payload in an entirely separate integrity layer, typically a CRC32 checksum computed over the uncompressed data, rather than relying on the compression format itself to survive or gracefully degrade under corruption. The checksum's function is purely detective, not corrective. It tells you decisively that corruption occurred, but the compressed stream itself offers no mechanism for recovery, precisely because its internal redundancy, the very quality that would have made recovery possible, was deliberately engineered out of existence in service of achieving maximal compaction. Shift the analysis now from the algorithmic domain to the physical geometry of storage, because file systems impose their own independent cost structure, orthogonal to anything happening at the compression layer. Storage media are not continuous, they are quantized into fixed-size allocation units. NTFS, FAT32, an extension for all allocate space in clusters, or blocks in extension for terminology, most commonly sized at 4 kilobytes, though this is configurable at format time. The fundamental rule governing allocation is that a file, regardless of its actual byte length, consumes a whole number of clusters, never a fraction of one. A file containing a single byte of data still requires the allocation of one entire 4 kilobyte cluster, because the file system's allocation table tracks cluster occupancy, not byte-level occupancy within a cluster. This produces a phenomenon universally termed internal fragmentation, or slack space, the difference between a file's logical size and the physical space it consumes on disk. For that 1-byte file, the logical size is reported as 1 byte, but the size on disk is reported as 4096 bytes, meaning 4095 bytes of that allocated cluster are physically reserved, unusable by any other file, and entirely wasted. The severity of this waste scales with the statistical distribution of file sizes on a given volume, and it is worth being precise about the arithmetic. Expected slack space per file, assuming file sizes are uniformly distributed relative to cluster boundaries, averages out to half the cluster size, meaning roughly 2 kilobytes of waste per file on a volume using 4 kilobyte clusters. On a file system hosting hundreds of thousands of small files, log fragments, configuration snippets, thumbnail caches, browser cache entries, source code files, this average waste compounds into an aggregate figure running into gigabytes, not because any individual file is large, but because the allocation granularity is coarse relative to the typical payload size. This is a purely geometric cost, entirely independent of anything the compression algorithm does or does not achieve. Even a perfectly compressed file still rounds up to consume a whole cluster, meaning compaction at the algorithmic level and waste at the file system level operate as two separate, non-cancelling cost centers. This raises the obvious engineering question: why not simply abandon fixed-size clusters and allocate storage at true byte-level granularity, eliminating slack space entirely? The answer lies in the cost of metadata and indexing, and this is where the file system level trade-off mirrors, structurally, the same exchange rate logic seen at the compression layer. Every file on an NTFS volume requires a corresponding entry in the master file table, and every MFT entry carries a fixed baseline overhead, historically around 1 kilobyte per record, encoding attributes such as file name, timestamps, security descriptors, and pointers to the data runs describing where on disk the file's clusters physically reside. This overhead is paid once per file, regardless of whether that file is 1 byte or 1 gigabyte, precisely because the MFT is designed around fixed-size records to permit rapid, predictable index lookup. Knowing a file's MFT record number allows the file system driver to compute its exact byte offset within the MFT directly, without needing to scan preceding records, an operation that would be impossible if record sizes varied per file. Now imagine the alternative architecture, one in which the file system attempted to track allocation at the byte level rather than the cluster level, packing files tightly against one another with no rounding to fixed boundaries. Free space could no longer be represented efficiently as a simple bitmap, 1 bit per cluster, indicating occupied or free. It would instead require tracking arbitrary byte ranges, which fragments the free space representation into a far larger and more irregular set of intervals, dramatically increasing the size and complexity of the structures needed to answer even a simple question such as where can I find enough contiguous free space to write this new file. Every allocation and deallocation would require updating a much finer-grained, much more volatile map of free byte ranges, rather than flipping single bits in a compact bitmap, and the resulting fragmentation of free space would itself degrade write performance over time as files became scattered across ever smaller surviving byte-level gaps. The CPU and I/O bandwidth spent maintaining this finer-grained bookkeeping on every single file operation across the entire volume would very quickly exceed the storage space theoretically reclaimed by eliminating cluster rounding. This is the historical justification for offloading the burden of fine-grained compaction to algorithms operating above the file system, compression software acting on file contents, rather than embedding that granularity into the file system's own allocation geometry. The file system trades a bounded, predictable, cheaply indexed waste at the cluster level for a metadata structure that remains small, fast to traverse, and computationally cheap to maintain, while the much harder problem of actually shrinking the data's true information content is delegated entirely to a separate algorithmic layer, one explicitly designed and optimized for that single purpose, and one that, as established, pays its own entirely separate price in cycles, cache pressure, and structural fragility. Neither the file system's cluster geometry nor the compression algorithm's entropy coding can absorb the other's cost. They are two independent taxation regimes, operating at different layers of the stack, both extracting payment for the same underlying ambition, that of representing information using less physical space than it would otherwise naturally require.
The physics of the network medium introduce a volatile, highly nonlinear vector into the compaction equation, the structural vulnerability of an entropy-encoded or dictionary-compressed bitstream during transit across a lossy infrastructure. In an uncompressed data stream, the transmission medium is inherently forgiving. If a network interface drops an Ethernet frame or corrupts an IP packet containing raw, uncompressed linear pulsecode modulated, PCM, audio or a raw uncompressed bitmap, the loss is strictly localized. The receiving application experiences a transient, predictable glitch, a microsecond of digital silence or a single isolated pixel anomaly, because each discrete block of bytes carries payload data whose interpretation is mathematically independent of its precursors or successors. The moment an algorithmic compressor strips this native redundancy away, converting the asset into a hyperdense, interdependent chain of prefix codes or dictionary backreferences, this structural resilience completely evaporates. The network transport layer must now interface with one of two fundamentally opposed routing philosophies: Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, or User Datagram Protocol, UDP. This choice does not merely dictate transmission speed, It governs whether a compressed topology survives the journey or undergoes immediate, catastrophic structural collapse. Transmission Control Protocol is an explicit, stateful enforcement of mathematical determinism over an inherently chaotic, best-effort physical medium. It operates as a connection-oriented, full-duplex byte stream abstraction, guaranteeing three non-negotiable architectural properties: in-order delivery, error-free arrival, and duplication prevention. To achieve this absolute reliability, TCP wraps the compressed payload in a 20-byte baseline header governed by an intricate, state-driven acknowledgement matrix. Every transmitted byte is assigned a unique 32-bit sequence number. The receiving network stack tracks these numbers via a continuous sliding window, verifying the integrity of the stream by emitting acknowledgement (ACK) frames back to the sender. If a packet is dropped due to intermediate router buffer bloat, packet reordering, or electromagnetic interference on a physical line, the receiving TCP stack detects an immediate fracture in the expected sequence continuity. At this precise moment, the destructive interaction between compression and transport manifests as head-of-line (HOL) blocking. Even if subsequent packets containing later segments of the compressed file arrive perfectly, the operating system kernel is legally barred from releasing this data to the application layer. It must retain these perfect packets in a kernel-level queue, halting the entire execution pipeline. Simultaneously, the receiver issues selective acknowledgements (SAC) or forces a retransmission timeout (RTO), compelling the sender to retransmit the missing segment across the physical distance of the network. On high-latency links or connections plagued by a high packet loss percentage, TCP's congestion control algorithms such as Neurino or Cubic actively collapse the congestion window (CWND), cutting transmission throughput by half or more to probe the network's carrying capacity. For non-real-time compressed archives like ZIP, XZIP, or raw tar.xz volumes, this punishing temporal tax is mandatory. Because an entropy decoder reads bits as a continuous, unbroken trajectory through a global Huffman or arithmetic tree, the omission of a single bit would shift the bitstream phase permanently, rendering every subsequent megabyte of data total, unrecoverable mathematical garbage. TCP trades temporal fluidity for absolute, unyielding data preservation. User Datagram Protocol explicitly rejects this stateful bookkeeping, prioritizing temporal immediacy over structural accuracy. It operates as a connectionless, stateless, bare-bones datagram service, appending a minimalist 8-byte header to the payload before passing it straight to the Internet Protocol (IP) layer. UDP features no sequence validation, no acknowledgement mechanisms, no flow control loops, and no native capacity for retransmission. It is a pure fire-and-forget transport engine. By eliminating the sliding window overhead and the computational friction of ACK processing, UDP achieves the minimum theoretical transmission latency permitted by the physical speed of light through copper or glass, entirely immune to the synthetic stalls of head-of-line blocking. However, committing compressed data to a raw UDP wire requires a fundamental, radical restructuring of the compression algorithms themselves. Standard, continuous context time domain compressors like standard Lempel-ZIV cannot survive this environment. If a streaming application attempts to transmit an audio or data asset compressed via an ongoing, mutating dictionary over UDP, the loss of a single isolated datagram instantly vaporizes the dictionary synchronization between the encoder and decoder. The receiving state machine becomes mismatched, and the remaining multi-megabyte broadcast degrades instantly into chaotic white noise. To achieve viability on a UDP infrastructure, compression must be decoupled from global temporal dependencies and engineered as packet-independent, transform domain architectures, typified by lossy formats such as MP3, Advanced Audio Coding, AAC, or MPEG-4 video. Instead of treating the asset as an endless, linear bitstream, the encoder partitions the continuous signal into discrete, self-contained timeframes, typically spanning 20 to 40 milliseconds. Each independent frame undergoes a mathematical transformation via the modified discrete cosine transform, MDCT, which maps the time domain voltage fluctuations into static frequency domain bins. Inside this transform domain, a psychoacoustic model analyses the signal to calculate a dynamic masking threshold, stripping out frequencies that the human auditory system cannot perceive behind louder, adjacent signals. Crucially, the resulting compressed bitstream is packed into independent network packets, where each UDP datagram contains its own localized initialization vectors and quantization matrices, or references high-frequency synchronization nodes, such as MPEG intracoded frames, or iframes. If a UDP packet carrying an AAC or video frame is dropped by a saturated network switch, the decoder does not desynchronize or halt the application execution. It simply drops the localized frame, drops the signal energy briefly, invokes an error concealment algorithm to interpolate the missing acoustic or visual data from adjacent blocks, and instantly locks back onto the next arriving packet. The systemic fragility of compressed data is managed not by imposing a rigid, artificial reliability layer at the transport level, but by re-engineering the internal geometry of the compression algorithm to absorb the violent, non-deterministic reality of the network wire.
To bridge the conceptual chasm between information theory and physical acoustics, one must understand that compression is not merely an operation performed on static files, it is an active, real-time manipulation of energy, whether that energy manifests as electromagnetic voltage in an analog audio circuit or as sector allocation tables on a rotating magnetic platter. In the domain of acoustic signal processing, compression sheds its digital entropy skin and reveals its pure, thermodynamic nature. Dynamic range compression does not alter the discrete information content of a file, it alters the structural envelope of a continuous waveform. The fundamental objective is the radical reduction of the distance between the highest peak amplitude and the lowest noise floor, a process that directly dictates the psychoacoustic perception of power, density, spectral weight, and critically, musical sustain. The operational architecture of an analog or digital audio compressor relies on a continuous feedback or feed-forward control loop governed by four mathematical parameters: threshold, ratio, attack, and release. The input signal is split, with one path directed to the main gain reduction element and the other entering a specialized sidechain circuit. This sidechain computes the root mean square or peak voltage of the incoming waveform over a mathematically defined integration time. The moment this calculated voltage crosses the user-defined threshold, measured in decibels relative to full scale in the digital domain or dBu in the analog domain, the gain reduction engine activates. The severity of this attenuation is dictated by the ratio, which establishes a strict linear to logarithmic transfer function. A ratio of 4:1 dictates that for every 4 dB the input signal exceeds the threshold, the output is permitted to rise by only 1 dB. If the ratio is driven to infinity to 1, the compressor ceases to function as a variable gain amplifier and mutates into a brick wall limiter, establishing an absolute, non-negotiable mathematical ceiling above which no acoustic energy may pass. The temporal behavior of this gain envelope is rigorously regulated by attack and release constants, measured in milliseconds or microseconds. The attack time determines the latency of the voltage-controlled amplifier, field effect transistor, or digital attenuation algorithm in reaching full compression status once the threshold is breached. If the attack is too instantaneous, it obliterates the natural transient punch, the high-frequency initial strike of a drum stick or a guitar plectrum. The release time, conversely, dictates the rate of gain recovery once the input signal drops back below the threshold. It is precisely within this recovery phase that the phenomenon of acoustic sustain is engineered. Consider a plucked string instrument, such as an electric guitar or an analog synthesizer envelope. The initial transient strike possesses immense localized kinetic energy, which rapidly decays as the physical medium loses its vibrational momentum due to friction and structural dampening. By clamping down heavily on the initial transient with a calculated attack, and establishing a prolonged, mathematically calibrated release curve, the compressor suppresses the initial peak and gradually lifts the amplification factor as the natural signal dies away. This dynamic adaptation invokes the application of make-up gain. By boosting the entire compressed signal post-attenuation, the engineer artificially elevates the decaying tail of the waveform, matching its perceived volume to that of the initial strike. The physical duration of the string's vibration is entirely unchanged by the circuit, but its psychoacoustic persistence, its perceived sustain, is extended indefinitely, converting erratic transient energy into a dense, sustained block of uniform acoustic pressure. This active, real-time reshaping of an asset's envelope finds a profound, structural parallel in the historical computing landscape of the late 1980s and early 1990s, where software engineers faced a different kind of physical constraint, the punishing economic cost of magnetic storage media. This crisis gave rise to real-time disk compaction, a technology that operated at the absolute bottom of the operating system stack, epitomized by the fierce industrial warfare between Stacker, developed by Stack Electronics, and Microsoft's native double-space utility integrated into MS-DOS 6.0. To comprehend the sheer architectural audacity of real-time disk compression like Stacker, one must dissect the mechanics of low-level device drivers and the interrupt architecture of legacy x86 hardware. In a standard, uncompressed MS-DOS environment, when an application requests a file read or write operation, it issues an interrupt 21H call to the operating system kernel. The kernel processes the file allocation table and translates this logical request into physical sector coordinates via BIOS int13H calls, which directly manipulate the disk controller hardware. Stacker violently intercepted this entire pipeline by inserting a terminate and stay resident device driver directly into the data path before the OS kernel could finalize the I/O operation, creating a completely virtualized block device. To the operating system and standard applications, this Stacker drive presented itself as a standard, uncompressed block device with a standard, predictable file allocation table. In reality, the entire contents of that virtual drive were encapsulated inside a single, massive, hidden system file residing on the physical host drive, known as a compressed volume file. The engineering crisis of this architecture lay entirely in real-time execution speeds and memory constraints. A mainstream central processing unit of that era, such as a 33 MHz Intel for 86DX, possessed no hardware acceleration for bitstream manipulation or data compaction. This meant that every single sector read or write operation had to be compressed or decompressed on the fly within the critical path of the disk I/O loop, entirely in software. If the compression routine took too many CPU cycles, the system throughput would drop to an unusable crawl, causing the user to abandon the software. To survive this computationally hostile environment, Stack Electronics pioneered a proprietary hardware-software synthesis based on a highly optimized, hardware-conscious variant of the Lempelsiv algorithm, known as the LZS algorithm. The LZS engine completely discarded the massive multi-megabyte sliding windows used by modern offline archival tools like WinRAR or 7-zip. Instead, it strictly constrained its look-back dictionary window to a mere 2 kilobytes. This constraint ensured that the entire dictionary structure and hash chains could reside natively within the ultra-scarce, high-speed registers and conventional memory space, the lower 640 kilobytes region of the processor, completely avoiding the latency penalties of swapping data out to slower extended or expanded memory architectures. The internal geometry of a compressed volume file fundamentally rewrote the established rules of file system allocation. As established in the theoretical foundations of storage architecture, standard file systems like FAT16 allocate space in rigid, fixed-size clusters, often 4 kilobytes, 8 kilobytes, or even 16 kilobytes on larger volumes, resulting in massive slack space waste when small files are rounded up to the nearest boundary. Stacker completely demolished this spatial quantization. Inside the CVF, space was allocated not at the cluster level, but at the true sector fragment level, down to 512-byte boundaries or fewer via custom bit packing arrays. When a file was committed to the Stacker drive, the LZS engine compressed the incoming stream in real time, byte by byte. The device driver then packed the resulting variable length bitstream tightly against the exact termination bit of the preceding file's compressed data block, entirely eliminating internal fragmentation and slack space across the volume. The virtual FAT table mapped logical cluster numbers to a highly specialized, proprietary internal allocation table inside the CVF header, which dynamically tracked the exact, fractional byte and sector offsets on the physical host disk. This complex architectural acrobatics effectively doubled the apparent capacity of storage media, converting a standard 100 megabyte hard drive into a theoretical 200 megabyte volume. However, it achieved this economic miracle by pushing system stability to the absolute precipice. Because the entire virtual file system was compressed as a continuous, interdependent Lempelsiv stream within a single monolithic file, the structural fragility was total. If the physical platter suffered a minor magnetic degradation, if a bad sector developed on the host drive, or if a transient voltage fluctuation caused a memory corruption during a write cycle, the consequences were apocalyptic. A single corrupted bit would not merely damage an isolated file, it would corrupt the internal LZS dictionary markers or the custom allocation map inside the CVF header. Upon the next system boot, the Stacker device driver would attempt to parse the continuous bitstream, fail to find the synchronization markers, and instantly desynchronize. This resulted in the total, catastrophic vaporization of the entire virtual drive, rendering every single asset, directory, and byte contained within it completely unrecoverable. Microsoft, recognizing the existential strategic necessity of integrating this technology directly into the core operating system to compete with IBM's OS/2, cloned this architecture to create doublespace for MS-DOS 6.0. This triggered one of the most high-stakes, multi-million-dollar patent infringement lawsuits in software history. Stack Electronics ultimately won the legal battle, proving that the mathematical optimization of real-time bit manipulation within the constraints of x86 hardware was a proprietary crown jewel that could not be legally plundered. Both Stacker and doublespace operated as high-wire computational acts. They traded precious CPU clock cycles and risked total data extinction, all to bypass the unyielding physical and economic limits of the silicon and magnetic media of their time. The ultimate topological and mathematical schism within the architecture of data compaction lies between two entirely irreconcilable structural philosophies, lossless and lossy compression. Lossless compression operates under an absolute, non-negotiable operational mandate of perfect, deterministic reconstruction. Algorithms such as deflate, the foundational core of the ubiquitous zip archive format, which synthesizes Lempel-ZIF sliding window match finding with Huffman prefix coding, or FLAC, free lossless audio codec, treat the underlying bitstream as an inviolable sequence of symbolic structures. The original data state must be mathematically identical to the decompressed data state, bit for single bit, down to the lowest significant bit of the payload. In critical computational fields like executable binaries, relational database text tables, compilation source code, or cryptographic keys, a single altered bit does not merely degrade the asset, it results in immediate execution failure or total structural invalidation. To compress complex audio signals without the luxury of structural destruction, the FLAC format discards vocabulary-based dictionary matching, which fails completely on non-repeating acoustic waveforms, and instead implements an advanced mathematical framework known as linear predictive coding. The encoder processes the continuous digital audio samples and constructs a digital finite impulse response filter model that predicts the value of the next upcoming audio sample, x hat of n, based on a weighted linear combination of a specific number of preceding samples, defined by the predictor order p. The formula resolves as x hat of n equals the sum, from I equals 1 to p, of a sub I times x of n minus I. The core engineering challenge is determining the optimal predictor coefficients, a sub I, that minimize the energy of the residual error signal over a given frame. To achieve this in real time, the encoder computes the autocorrelation sequence of the windowed audio signal and solves the Yule-Walker equations using the highly optimized Levinson-Debin recursion algorithm. This recursive mathematical process calculates the coefficient step by step from order 1 up to order p, minimizing the mean squared error at each iteration without requiring computationally catastrophic matrix inversions. Instead of storing the massive, raw 16-bit or 24-bit amplitude values of each discrete sample, the FLAC framework stores only the small mathematical coefficients, a sub I, of this localized predictor model and the residual error, e of n equals x of n minus x hat of n, the microscopic, algebraic difference between the model's theoretical prediction and the actual physical signal captured by the analog-to-digital converter. Because this residual signal represents pure deviation rather than full signal amplitude, it possesses a dramatically lower amplitude envelope and variance than the original acoustic wave. Its statistical entropy is heavily collapsed, allowing it to be tightly packed using Rice coding, a highly efficient variant of Huffman coding optimized for exponentially distributed integers near zero, where the code parameter is dynamically adjusted per subframe based on the variance of the residuals. When the decoder parses the file, it runs the identical predictor model and adds the residual error back to the prediction at each clock cycle, reconstructing the exact original pulse code modulated wave with absolute mathematical fidelity, preserving the original noise floor and phase relationships completely intact. Lossy compression, typified by the Joint Photographic Experts Group Image Standard and the Moving Picture Experts Group Video and Audio Frameworks, explicitly abandons the requirement of mathematical identity. It replaces absolute numeric precision with a far more complex, non-deterministic metric, psychoacoustic and psychovisual approximation. Lossy architectures operate on the fundamental physiological premise that human sensory organs, the retina and the cochlea, are biological bottlenecks with highly nonlinear, constrained perception curves. The human eye cannot resolve high-frequency spatial luminance variations or subtle chrominance shifts in high-contrast zones. The human ear cannot perceive quiet acoustic frequencies immediately following or adjacent to a massive burst of sonic energy, a phenomenon known as temporal and spectral masking. Lossy compression is therefore not a process of accidental degradation, it is a system of deliberate, highly engineered destruction, removing data that the human brain is biologically incapable of processing. To execute this targeted elimination in an image file, the JPEG standard completely abandons the spatial pixel grid and translates the image into the spatial frequency domain using the discrete cosine transform. The raw image is first converted from the native RGB color space to YCBCR, separating the structural brightness, luminance, Y, from the color information, chrominance, CB and CR. Because the human eye is vastly more sensitive to brightness details than to color variations due to the dense concentration of rod cells relative to cone cells in the retina, the chrominance channels are immediately downsampled using a 4:2:0 or 4:2:2 sampling matrix, discarding half or 3/4 of the color data before any mathematical transformations even begin. The image is then partitioned into rigid grids of 8x8 blocks of pixels. Each 8x8 block undergoes a two-dimensional type II discrete cosine transform. The forward 2D DCTII maps the 64 spatial pixel values, f of x, y, into a matrix of 64 scalar frequency coefficients, f of u, v, according to the following mathematical formula: f of u, v equals 1/4 times c of u times c of v, multiplied by the double sum from x equals 0 to 7, and y equals 0 to 7 of f of x, y, times the cosine of the quantity 2x plus 1 times u pi over 16, times the cosine of the quantity 2y plus 1 times v pi over 16. The choice of the DCT over the standard discrete Fourier transform or fast Fourier transform is critical. The DFT assumes the 8x8 block repeats infinitely in all directions, which creates violent artificial discontinuities at the boundaries of the block if the left edge does not match the right edge. When transformed, these artificial edges generate massive high-frequency energy across the entire spectrum, a mathematical artifact known as the Gibbs phenomenon. The DCT avoids this by implicitly mirroring the 8x8 block at all boundaries, creating a continuous, symmetric signal that forces the energy to pack tightly into the lowest possible frequency coefficients. The top left coefficient, f of 0,0, represents the DC component, the average baseline brightness or color of the entire 8x8 block. The remaining 63 AC coefficients represent progressively higher spatial frequencies, tracking how rapidly the brightness or color fluctuates as you move horizontally and vertically across the block. At this precise stage, the transform is entirely lossless. The 64 frequency coefficients contain the exact same mathematical energy as the original 64 pixels, and running an inverse DCT would restore the block perfectly. The true act of lossy compression, the irreversible extraction of data, occurs in the subsequent phase, matrix quantization. The 64 frequency coefficients are divided, element by element, by a matching 8x8 quantization table, and the resulting numbers are rounded down to the nearest integer. The formula handles this as f quant of u, v equals round of f of u, v divided by q of u, v. The values inside the quantization table, q of u, v, are determined by empirical psychovisual testing. The numbers in the top left are small, preserving the critical low-frequency details that the human eye detects instantly, while the numbers in the bottom right grow exponentially larger, aggressively dividing and flattening the high-frequency coefficients. During this rounding process, high-frequency details, subtle textures, complex gradients, or fine patterns, are forced to zero. The resulting quantized matrix is heavily populated by zeros, particularly in the high-frequency regions. The encoder then reads this matrix in a zigzag pattern, starting from the DC component and winding down to the bottom right corner, converting the 2D grid into a 1D sequence where all the surviving non-zero coefficients are clustered at the beginning, followed by a long, continuous string of zeros. This sequence is finally compressed using run-length encoding to collapse the zeros, followed by a standard Huffman or arithmetic coder to pack the remaining numbers. When a JPEG is opened, the decoder multiplies the matrix back by the quantization table and runs the inverse DCT. However, because the rounding phase discarded the fractional remainders and crushed high-frequency coefficients to zero, the reconstructed pixels are an approximation. If the user drives the compression factor too high by increasing the values in the quantization matrix, the high-frequency data responsible for sharp edges vanishes entirely, and the boundaries between the independent 8x8 blocks become visible, manifesting as blocky, digital artifacting. The compression ratio achieved is immense, often shrinking an image to 10% or 5% of its uncompressed size, but the price paid is the irreversible destruction of the original digital canvas, trading absolute mathematical truth for a highly optimized visual illusion. This spatial frequency destruction finds its exact acoustic counterpart in the MPEG audio architectures, MP3 and AAC, which operate in the temporal frequency domain. The continuous time domain PCM audio stream is passed through a bank of polyphase filters or a quadrature mirror filter bank, which divides the signal into 32 separate subbands. Simultaneously, the signal is analyzed by a fast Fourier transform running a parallel psychoacoustic model. This model calculates the precise masking threshold across the 24 critical bands of the human auditory system, known as Bark scale units. If a dominant, high-energy tone exists at 1000 Hz within a specific subband, it creates a dynamic masking curve that raises the absolute threshold of hearing for all adjacent frequencies within that Bark band. Any acoustic energy or noise floor components falling below this mathematically generated masking curve are deemed entirely imperceptible. The encoder's bit allocation engine then dynamically allocates bits to each subband. Subbands containing unmasked, critical audio signals receive high bit depths, up to 16 bits, while subbands falling entirely within a masked zone receive 0 bits, silencing them completely. The frequency coefficients of the subbands are then quantized using a nonlinear power law quantizer, which inherently scales quantization noise to match the masking threshold, ensuring that the distortion introduced by the loss of numeric precision is entirely hidden beneath the natural energy peaks of the audio program. Like the JPEG framework, the MPEG audio stream trades mathematical accuracy for a perceptual simulation, discarding gigabytes of physical signal energy to exploit the structural limits of human sensory biology. Now that the comment section is open on YouTube, I explicitly invite you all to share your analytical reactions, conceptual ideas, and specific technical requests in the space below. Let us maintain and advance this ongoing conversation with deep, mutual respect for each individual's cognitive development and language learning journey. Keep boosting your English. Bye for now.
to boost your